We're going to talk leaders, challenges, and events of the civil rights movement. Okay, that's where we're going with the rest of our conversation here. Leaders of the movement. Obviously, the face of the movement is Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Actually, he was a Baptist preacher who got his start where, Slade? I don't know. Where did you want to take those pictures? West, not true. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia. Yeah, he's a Baptist preacher that got his start in Atlanta, Georgia. So he is a Georgian. And Slade actually showed me his family has visited Martin Luther King Jr.'s first church, his main church, I believe, where he had Slade, where he was the preacher in the pulpit. And little side extra, since Slade kind of brought it up, that church still stands today. Obviously, it has preachers. The most recent preacher from this church is, do you know? Anybody pay attention to anything? The most recent preacher at Martin Luther King Jr.
The dude that you just said for a while.
That I did just say it's Devin, and he still can't remember.
I don't remember.
It is Senator Raphael Warnock. So the gentleman who just got elected to the Senate, African-American man, he ran for Senate, and one of his big things was, I'm a reverend. I preach at the church where Martin Luther King Jr. pastored. Obviously, he has other beliefs as well, but that was one of his big claims to fame, is that he was at the church where Martin Luther King Jr. was. So we know Martin Luther King Jr. for a lot of things. The I Have a Dream speech, we're going to talk about that. This statement right here comes from another famous thing he wrote called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. So just let me read it to you. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So having read this quote, what do you think Martin Luther King Jr. stands for?
Wait, hold up. He stands
peace.
Being equal.
Half hand. Peace, unity, equality, yes, and nonviolence. One of his big methods of protest was nonviolent resistance. He actually was inspired to do this by Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a civil rights leader in India, the country of India. You can see he's Hindu based on the way he dresses. You can tell he's a little bit from a different religion. So Gandhi was nonviolent, right? He was very often beat up. He was arrested. He had rocks thrown at him. He had rubber bullets fired at him, but he never swung back. Okay, he never raised his fist in anger. Gandhi advocated nonviolence. Martin Luther King Jr., about 10 years later, observing the life of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. also takes up the strategy of nonviolence, which is pretty different from the way people protest today. Okay, today people break things, burn things, cuss, yell, scream, graffiti, deface, right? That's how people protest today. Martin Luther King Jr.'s main idea was coordinated nonviolent resistance. And that is a very important piece of his legacy. There is, and actually I got it as one of my screens. So I'll point at you when I pull that screen up.
I'm fine.
He does a variety of things. One of which is the Montgomery bus boycott. He also leads Freedom Riders. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. So that is the most prestigious, highest award for advocating for peace. He's recognized as a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He wins that in 1964. A couple more pictures and thoughts here. Here's kind of that nice, tidy definition. A very influential leader of the civil rights movement. I think that's putting it very lightly. He's known for his I Have a Dream speech and his letter from a Birmingham jail. He was assassinated in 1968 by a white supremacist. I've mentioned 1968 several times, a landmark year in U.S. history. One of the major events was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So very sad that his life got cut short. Sometimes I wonder what else he could have accomplished in his life. But his legacy has certainly carried forward civil rights, nonviolence, and that type of a movement. Now, I told you earlier that I want you to write down the things in green. Why then would I have made the name of his assassin small and in not green?
It's not
Because it's not important. Right now, in history, do we know the names of bad guys? Sure. Do we study the names of criminals? Sure.
No.
But I think it's more important to note that he got assassinated by hate. It doesn't matter who pulled the trigger. He was assassinated by hate. And yes, it was outside of his hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. So who else is in the picture with him here? Who's kind of in the background?
The president.
That's right, President Johnson. So do you think it's pretty notable that they talk together and work together?
Yes.
Yep. So he is he's rubbing elbows with the highest of power, the President of the United States. He's advocating for his beliefs to the president, much like his forerunner, A. Philip Randolph. A lot of people say that Martin Luther King Jr. came 20 years later with the same messages as A. Philip Randolph, just in a different time, in a different place. Here is a picture of him in jail. In his nonviolent protests, he very often found himself in handcuffs. Why? If you're not being violent, you're not committing a crime, you're not harming anyone, why would he be arrested?
Because he had so many people speaking against the government.
Speaking against the government, he had a lot of people. Yeah, in their nonviolence, sometimes they actually set out to get arrested. One of their big strategies was called a sit-in, meaning they would go to a segregated business, a restaurant, or public transportation, and they would sit in the whites-only section. Technically breaking the law, right? Technically breaking the law, but it was nonviolent. All they did was sit down. They sat there, and they were not going to move. They were not going to move. This is called a sit-in. Eventually, they may be arrested, but what they showed the world was how they were not fighting back. The people who fought were those who were arresting them. They actually were made to look like a fool. Sometimes they would have condiments dumped on them. Sometimes they'd have water splashed on them or thrown in their face. And all the while, they did not resist. So it showed the world, especially as pictures and video came out, it showed the world how these African Americans were being treated very, very poorly. And still, they remained calm, peaceful, nonviolent. And for the people who were doing it in the Deep South, I really believe they kind of had blinders on their eyes, right? There were so many emotions. You couldn't tell them otherwise. It was how they were raised. I'm certainly not making excuses for it. It was very wrong behavior. But in the Deep South, you couldn't see otherwise. But in Iowa, in Minnesota, or Oregon, California, as these pictures got out of these nonviolent protesters being beat on, the country and the world started to say, oh, we're not behaving very civilly, right? We are not treating these people very well at all. So pictures, video, the media, very important to getting out the message of the civil rights movement. I want to hang out on the letter from the Birmingham jail really quick. So he writes this letter from jail. Picture of him in jail. That's kind of how I started my tangent here, that he got arrested several times. He writes this letter to pastors in Alabama. And the reason he writes this letters to pastors is because the pastors have been encouraging him to back down. Sounds a little crazy, right? But many pastors, which he's a pastor himself, many of his fellow pastors were saying, hey, just wait. Let time work this out. You don't need to do these protests. You don't need to keep getting arrested. Just let time work itself out. Well, here is his response to those pastors. It's not on the screen, so I'm just going to read it to you. King also criticized the clergy for urging patience in light of the continued violence. He says, for years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Why didn't he want to wait?
Because he was tired of waiting now.
He was tired of waiting. His people have always waited. From being slaves and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to being in bondage in the American South, wait is all they've ever been told. He says the time for action is now. So this is his response to those saying that he should wait. He defended the use of nonviolent protests. He said, we will not wait, we will take action. Not violent action, but we will take action.
You think he'll be happy today?
Ooh, that's a deep question. Do I think he would be happy today? Put me on the spot. I think we've certainly made progress, and I think he would say something along the lines that we still have more work to do.
I feel like he'd have another one of his speeches.
So since you bring it up, that's kind of a great point. Many people, he died young, right? He was assassinated he could have still continued his life and done more work. Many of his followers, many people who marched with him, maybe they weren't the face of the civil rights movement at the time, but in their later years, they gained their own momentum. Some of those people are Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, from right here in Georgia, Congressman John Lewis, who recently passed away. So some of his followers did continue the message. John Lewis talks about getting into good trouble. What's good trouble?
Like trouble that'll be good.
Yeah.
Like basically what he's doing right there. in that
Unless
photo.
he's talking about like a bunch of trouble.
Not a bunch of trouble. I understand what you mean by that. He's saying, did Martin Luther King Jr. deserve to be in jail?
No, he got in trouble for
So
no
you
reason.
might be in trouble by the man, the law,
you did it
the
for a
long
good
arm of the law. But yeah, there's good trouble to be had. So John Lewis writes about good trouble. That's a very deep question, Angel. I'm very impressed with your line of questions there. Devin.
How old was he when he got killed?
How old was he when he got killed? I'm not sure of his age. Mr. Taylor, how old was he when he got killed? I'm not sure when he was born. Two different photos here. So a mug shot, and then him looking outside of his jail cell. Another mug shot. He was arrested time after time again. I don't know the total number, but many times.
39.
This is,
Yeah.
I like you guys having a Chromebook. I'm okay with it. This is the actual letter from a Birmingham jail. So you can see it's not some big old book, right? It's not some 10,000 word essay. It's just a letter. What is that, 8 paragraphs? Just this 8-paragraph letter that he literally wrote in jail. And you might think that jail would silence a man.
It did.
Obviously it didn't. This is a very popular text to this day. A lot of ELA classes read and dissect this text right here. Have you guys ever done that? Third block didn't. Yes, they know. So a lot of times an ELA class will dive into a letter from the Birmingham jail because of how it's persuasive, because of how it just lays out its case in a persuasive manner. So there it is, right there. Not some big old document, just a pretty simple letter from a Birmingham jail. It does remind me that you got to take yourself to world history, not U.S. history. It does remind me of another person who wrote letters from jail that were pretty influential. Can you think of who I'm thinking of?
Who?
I'm thinking of a person who wrote letters from jail, and his letters were very influential to the world.
That one dude. The
Oh wait, I thought it was the other dude.
So some students in third block said Eugene Debs, the socialist who ran for president from jail, and that's in our class. I hear that. I'm thinking of, I said, you got to read about world history. I'm thinking of the Apostle Paul, who wrote about half of the New Testament in the Bible. Most of them were letters that he sent from jail. So let me give this to you. This is a big thought. A lot of times we think that having a good life is big house, good car, lots of money. Hey, sometimes you make a difference because of how you fight through adversity. Your biggest legacy might be a letter from jail. Nobody wants to be in jail, but he made a difference because of his persistence in nonviolent protest. His life was cut short, but still he made a big difference in his life. Do I have a hand? Did I see a hand?
Yeah, I got
What
one.
you got?
So we actually talked to one of the women from like at their church.
Okay.
She said that they actually had to put bulletproof glass because people kept shooting at their church.
That is sad, but I'm not surprised, unfortunately. I think so. There is still hate in the world today.
There was an accident.
Still hate in the world today. Did we get his age?
39.
39.
So,
Oh, that's right. You did.
And he
say
was
that.
arrested 29 times.
that wasn't a question though.
That's
He
true.
said he didn't know.
I did say I didn't know, but I didn't
He'd been
officially ask the question. 2 more quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. This is another snippet from the letter. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a single garment of our destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. He's saying you can't oppress the African American and expect to have a good moral society. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're all in this together. I can't count how many times I've said that across world and U.S. history. We are all in this together. Let's start acting like it. One more quote. This also comes from the letter. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined, legal, and nonviolent pressure. So it goes back to that idea that he is not going to back down. We are not going to hear wait. We are going to continue to do action now. Question?
I actually got to say something.
Okay, send it.
He was in jail for 14 days, all right? And his fine was $14. Guess who paid it?
The president.
Police commissioner.
Oh, that's good. The police commissioner. The man who put him in jail? That's interesting. Sometimes a lawman got to follow the law, and maybe he don't agree with the law. All right. So a couple more faces of the movement, right? Obviously, we hung out with MLK for a while. Rosa Parks, she is also a face of the movement. She's actually called the first lady of the civil rights movement. She's not on your notes. It's a little extra. But how can you teach the civil rights movement without talking about Rosa Parks? I actually know, have you talked Rosa Parks before?
Yeah.
Very often, she's kind of elementary school curriculum. Mason did a project on Rosa Parks when we were in Oklahoma. I think it's her 3rd grade class. So Rosa Parks, the first lady of the civil rights movement. Remember that the gender equality movement is also tied to the civil rights movement. So we've seen the face of the civil rights movement is a man. We've seen a lot of men. Let's not forget that women are also a part of the movement and fighting for their own equality. She is famous for, well, you tell me, what's she famous for?
Civil rights. Civil rights.
Refusing to move on a bus. Yeah, so she
sat in
sat,
the back of the bus.
she sat down, she was allowed to sit down initially, okay? She did not sit in a white-only section, but she sat in a seat where if more white people came on the bus, she would have to stand up and go to the back of the bus. When more white people came on the bus, the driver said, you stand up, go to the back of the bus. And she said, tell the devil no, not today. Probably, paraphrase, Swanson, 2022. She said no. She said no. She kept her seat. For that, she was arrested. Here is a picture of her being booked, okay, fingerprinted. She was actually specially selected for this action, okay? I know we like to think that she was just tired. She's coming home from work. She sat down and she said nope. She was actually chosen to protest at this time in this moment.
So the tired was just a myth.
The what?
When she said I was tired and all that, it was just a myth.
I don't want to say just a myth, but she was selected for this action. Okay. Sometimes, here's a saying for you: to make an omelet, you gotta break some eggs, right? You want to eat an omelet. To make an omelet, you gotta
3 eggs. That's
crack some eggs. Yeah, 3-egg omelet. So they knew that when they were getting arrested for some of their actions, they knew that they were cracking some eggs. But if you want to have some results, if you want to actually have some legislation come from it, to make an omelet, you gotta crack some eggs. So she was purposefully selected to sit on the bus to get arrested, and the story that comes from it, the photographs, her interviews in the newspaper, it brought a lot of awareness to the bus issue in Birmingham, Alabama. So that is Montgomery, Alabama. So anyway, that's Rosa Parks. Malcolm X. Malcolm X is actually the opposite of Martin Luther King Jr. in terms of his strategies. Malcolm X was not in favor of nonviolence. He was in favor of radical action. I'm not saying he was saying go create violence, but he wasn't about the kumbaya, we're all in this together, we will overcome type of singing. Like he actually wanted to crack some eggs, you know what I mean? He was well-spoken. He was more radical than Martin Luther King Jr. He disagreed with the nonviolence. He's got a quote here that just goes opposite of Martin Luther King Jr. He says, what do we gain from nonviolence? He was in that category of, nonviolence is basically the same as waiting, right? If you want to do something, you gotta go make some noise. So all that to say, he's in the same category of being a civil rights movement leader, but he disagreed with the nonviolent strategy. So that kind of made him oppose. He and Martin Luther King Jr. obviously they didn't agree on that one in particular. And then Robert F. Kennedy. What is different about him compared to the people I've shown so far? He's white. He's a white guy, right? This is important. It is not a minority movement. It's a human movement. The civil rights movement, securing the rights for minorities, is not just a colored person's movement. It's a human movement. And Robert F. Kennedy was a very important Caucasian man who was on the side of civil rights, who was for the advancement of colored people, African Americans and otherwise. He is the U.S. Attorney General, so that's a very important position. He's the Attorney General for who? For what president?
John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, so John F. Kennedy is his brother. And this is where I told you we're going to talk about the president specifically. I'm kind of assuming that you have some context for John F. Kennedy here. John F. Kennedy was his brother. He is the Attorney General. The Attorney General is often called the nation's top cop. So he's in charge of enforcing all the laws. Well, he actually is disagreeing with certain Jim Crow style laws. He is in favor of civil rights and he wants to take on segregationist type of laws. One of the movements he supports is called the Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders, I got a picture for you here in just a second. They are Northerners who would fill up charter buses in Boston, New York City, northern states. They'd ride these buses down to the South where all the protests were happening. And, they're just coming to participate in the protests. They are people of all colors and genders, right? Male and female. But they live in the North. They want to help in the South, so they ride the buses down. Well, if you are a racist Southerner and you don't want people participating in these protests, a lot of these buses got met kind of on the outskirts of the town, stopped on a one-town highway, right? Stopped on a one-lane road, and many of the buses were damaged, beat with baseball bats, burned. So freedom riders were coming to support the protests, but there were also people who were trying to oppose the freedom riders, trying to beat their buses and burn their buses. I got a picture to show you what I mean here in just a second. And he spends a life of service in favor of desegregation. He's a senator from New York, so he's got a long legacy of being in favor of civil rights. He's got a pretty powerful quote here. He says, "Every time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sounds out a tiny ripple of hope." What's a ripple?
A little bit.
Yeah, so you take a little stone, stand on the edge of the pond, throw it in the middle of the pond, boop. What comes on the surface of the water?
Waves.
Yeah, those are ripples. From one little stone, or from what he's saying, one act of kindness, one act of standing up for a fellow man,
Ripple.
yeah, it's gonna ripple out into a bigger impact. So you may wonder how you can make a difference. Robert F. Kennedy says one action has a ripple of hope. So just start small. Just do one thing, it'll ripple outward. Unfortunately, Robert F. Kennedy, brother of President JFK, he runs for president in 1968. There we have it again, 1968, landmark year. He is not elected president. As you can see, there's no RFK on the wall here. Who wins the 1968 election? That's Nixon, because RFK is assassinated. RFK does not have a chance to become president because he is killed while campaigning for president. Here's that story. I know it's assassinations are always interesting. He was killed by a man. Go ahead.
Do you think he would have become president?
Yeah, Andreas, great question. Do I think he would have become president? The polls say that he was leading the race. Realistically speaking, this happens in June of 1968, 4 months before the election. Okay, so 4 more months of campaigning. All signs were saying he was leading the race. He probably would have become the president. Now, as it happens, the Democrats, with only 4 months left to go, they got to find another candidate and who's it going to be? And in the end, Nixon wins the election because the Democrats, their second choice was not as powerful of a candidate. So yes, I do think that he would have become president. Essentially, the future president of the United States was assassinated. The man who shot him, his name is Sirhan Sirhan. That is the same word twice. Okay, Sirhan Sirhan. He's an Arab man, right? So Kennedy wasn't killed because of his stance on civil rights. He was killed because Sirhan Sirhan did not appreciate his support of Israel. Sirhan Sirhan was Arab. He was Muslim. Kennedy was in support of the state of Israel. So Sirhan Sirhan shoots him because of his support of Israel. Here's how it actually happened. Kennedy was campaigning at a hotel in California. He had just given a speech. He was kind of taken to that downstairs area where the kitchen was, the hotel kitchen. He's shaking hands with the kitchen staff, kind of pretty cool, right? He's not rubbing shoulders with anyone famous. He's just greeting the regular people. He's actually shaking the hand of a 16-year-old boy right as he's shot. So he's shaking this kid's hand. This kid's like a dishwasher, right? Just working for a living. He's a dishwasher. Shaking this kid's hand. Sirhan Sirhan comes up to him. 2 shots into his gut. And Kennedy falls down. So this kid that's been shaking his hand, he kind of falls with him a little bit. There's actually pictures of it. And Kennedy does not die immediately. There's actually photos where he's alert, he's aware, he's kind of looking around, he's even talking to the people who are around him. But he later expires. He dies due to blood loss because he'd been shot. So pretty tragic story, the story of the Kennedy family. Just because you're rich, just because you're famous, and just because you're president doesn't mean you're going to have an easy life.
It's like Mexico, bro. Like in Mexico, the people don't agree with the president, they kill the president.
That's yeah. Just because you're rich and famous doesn't mean you have an easy life. We also talked about the Lincolns. They had tragedy in their life where their children passed away young. So just because you're rich and famous, or even the president, doesn't mean you're going to have an easy life. Nobody ever said it would be easy. Talon?
I got this a little off topic.
Sure.
People that was arrested, it was a little over 3,600.
When? In one of the rallies?
Yeah, during the civil rights movement.
Okay, that's a lot. That is a lot of arrests for nonviolent protests. A couple of challenges along the way here, and a couple of these things we kind of already talked about. I got a couple of extra pictures. This is from the Little Rock Nine. The black young woman, her name is Elizabeth Eckford. She's attending to go to school at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And of course, what we see behind her is the screaming woman. This woman actually later reconnected. These two ladies reconnected. And the lady in the background, the white gal, she apologized and she blamed her parents and her upbringing. What do we think about that?
It's kind of funny.
Kind of funny?
I mean,
Yeah.
for a little kid, maybe that's reasonable, but when you're old enough to see the world on your own.
Yeah. Kind of a cop out, right? I wish she would have said I had bad attitudes when I was younger and I've made a change in my life. Like, what kind of a Christian would I be if you can't make a change? I believe people can have a bad life, turn around, and then live differently. So I don't think we should hold it against her forever. But clearly, in this moment, she is expressing some anger and some hate towards this black young woman who's just trying to go to school. Next picture here, these are the sit-ins, and you can see how these individuals are just sitting. They're just present. And while they're not moving, they're getting condiments poured on them, water, Coke, soda, whatever. Photographs like this change the conversation. The people who are doing this, they got to be ashamed of themselves, right? Looking back on this photography after a lot of time, this guy's probably like, wow, what was I doing? That was not a very kind thing to do. Photographs like this change the conversation because as these pictures went around the country, a lot of people of all races, especially white people were like, what's going on? Like, this is not a very human thing to do. So photography like this in the media really changed the conversation. This is the Freedom Riders that I was talking about. They're on the bus going south to support the protests, but sometimes they got caught at the edge of the city. Their bus would get hijacked. Their bus would get burned. This was the Freedom Riders. Similarly, sometimes protests were broken up with fire hoses. Protests were broken. Obviously, the strength of a fire hose is very strong. Could knock a person down. Could definitely hurt your face, your eyes, your teeth if you got hit right in the face. So just one way that these nonviolent protests were broken up. And then another one is with police dogs. Again, a well-dressed young man minding his own business. He is not creating any problems with violence because it's a nonviolent protest. And police dogs are deployed in this situation. This is called the soiling of Old Glory, where it appears that this young man is going to harpoon this well-dressed black guy with the American flag. The man who's being restrained, the African-American guy, he's actually an NAACP lawyer. So he's he's a well-educated, respected professional being treated like garbage in this moment. What is something else you noticed about this photograph? Like where it was taken and when it was taken?
Downtown.
1976.
Oh, 1976. That's actually a long time after and in a northern city. So that's not to say, I see you. That's not to say that this was all just down south. This was also happening in Boston. Let me hurry up and kind of finish out. So 1963, the March on Washington. This is the famous I Have a Dream speech where Martin Luther King Jr. speaks. Hey, stop. Give it to the class, okay? Go above your neck.
I'm sore.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech
I
builds support for civil rights legislation, and it shows the power of nonviolent protest. Something really amazing about this is how many people were in the crowd and who was in the crowd. Look at this picture right here.
It says assassination person. Williams Booth or something. No.
That is.
I'm way off.
Lincoln.
Look at this crowd, and who do you see in this crowd? What type of person?
White people.
White people.
All types of people, right? So it was not an African American movement. It was not a minority movement. It was a human movement. It was a human movement. Some incredibly powerful speech that he gave on this day. Actually, I'm running out of time, but I'm gonna try to tell you briefly tell you the whole story here. He very frequently gave similar speeches. Okay, I mean he had his speeches memorized, and he'd meet at churches or different convention centers, and he'd give a similar speech. Politicians do that all the time, right? They have their basic speech that they give. So on this day, it was hot. There wasn't a lot. There was no air conditioning, of course. There wasn't a lot of breeze. The audio was not very good. Okay, so the wide open spaces, the audio wasn't very good, and the crowd was actually getting restless. As he's speaking, kind of like you guys probably do when I speak sometimes. The crowd was starting to get restless. Well, someone from behind, Dr. King, says, Reverend King, give him the dream, give him the dream. So he stops from his prepared speech, right? He sets those notes aside, and he goes back to his regular speech, the I have a dream speech. And he does it from memory. He just goes with it. And when he starts saying, I have a dream, and I can show you the video at the end of our class here. I have a dream. The crowd keys back in. The crowd wakes up. There's a buzz. There's a chatter. There's an excitement. There's an energy because he started giving them his dream. And I want to tell you real quick side note. I've done a lot of reading on this one in particular. One of my favorite books is a book called Start With Why. And this book says that if you really want to speak to someone, if you really want to get their attention, tell them why you're doing something. And there's actually a bit of writing in here about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And the author in this book says he did not give them the I Have a Plan speech. He didn't give them some 14-point peace plan. He didn't tell them how to achieve peace. He gave them a dream. He gave them the why. So very powerful speech, kind of tapped into the human emotions of why I have a dream. He gave them the dream. He gave them the I Have a Dream speech. Devin?
You know, he didn't write it. He didn't write I Have a Dream speech.
Who wrote it?
Clarence Jones.
Okay. People have speech writers. A lot of people have speech writers. Now I don't like you having a Chromebook anymore. All right. This is a picture of my friend sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which is where the speech happened. Obviously, this was just this past year, so 2021. And he is showing his kids Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. He's sitting exactly where Martin Luther King Jr. was. And thanks to technology, he's got YouTube up, and he is showing his kids the I Have a Dream speech. And I want to show that to you to say, this place is still there. You can go and visit this in Washington, D.C. right now. Slade has. We haven't been to D.C. yet since moving back to Georgia. I really want to take my kids. I want to do exactly this. I want to sit right there and tell them the I Have a Dream speech, just like Martin Luther King Jr. gave it right on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So I think that's pretty cool that my friend did that. I asked his permission to use this picture in class. All right, let's round it out. So from the I Have a Dream speech, from the March on Washington, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It is introduced by President JFK. Unfortunately, JFK was assassinated. He never saw it come to the end. His vice president becomes president. That's Johnson. And Johnson is able to get this passed based on the legacy of JFK. Right? JFK starts it. He dies, unfortunately, but his legacy, his motivation, his energy kind of sees it through to the end. And Johnson is able to use his legacy to get this passed. This is very normal for you today to know this language. Prohibits discrimination based off of race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. Any business, anywhere has a sign posted that says exactly that. If you apply for a job, you're going to sign a little form that says, this company does not prohibit based off of discriminate based off of race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. So this is very normal today, but it comes about to be in 1964. This is what finally outlawed segregation in public facilities. Brown versus Board outlawed segregation in schools. Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation everywhere else. The restaurants, the public transportation, all the other places. So Brown versus Board, schools, Civil Rights Act, everywhere else. We all are living in the legacy of this, right? It's very normal for us today to go to a facility that's fully integrated. Obviously, no division between white, black, brown, red, and yellow, black, and white. They're precious in His sight because of this. Civil Rights Act of 1964. One more for you, just to round it out. This is extra. It's not on your notes. The next year is passed what's called the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this officially outlaws literacy tests for voting. So you might say, finally, Jim Crow era laws are officially banished. And of course, what this is going to do is increase who voting? Everybody, I like that, but specifically African Americans. And from an increased African American turnout at the polls, who eventually becomes president?
That dude.
Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Really, I know it's 65 all the way to 2008, but because African Americans have no restrictions on going to the polls, because nobody has restrictions on going to the polls, eventually the African American vote is going to carry Barack Obama into office, and of course he is the first African American president. We'll talk about the whole line of presidents come next week, but I was just throwing that one at you right now. Leads to the final legacy. Now, my world historians, you've seen pretty much this slide before. The final legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is protest and reform. Much like his namesake, Martin Luther. Do you remember the Protestant Reformation? And Martin Luther protest, 95 Theses, thank you. Protest against the Catholic
Why are
Church.
you laughing? I knew what I was talking about.
His name, the name of the 15th century reformer, 16th century reformer is Martin Luther. Well, from that we get Martin Luther King Jr., and this is his legacy, protest and reform. Devin, Angel, you guys kind of asked about what do I think about his thoughts today. Well, a lot of these men who protested alongside him, some of them are still alive today. I said Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, John Lewis recently passed away. It wasn't just Martin Luther King Jr., okay? He was the leader. He was the face of the movement, but it wasn't just him. You can see he's got his arms locked with many others alongside him. Final thought, Angel, you recognize this? I always like to recommend movies to you.
Remember
On the
the
left-hand
Titans.
side is a movie called Selma. I actually haven't seen it, okay? And I always want to give you some honesty. I haven't seen it. I have read a review that said it's got some iffy historical accuracies in it. So anytime you watch a movie, just make sure you know the real history, not just because what it's on the movie. And then, of course, not a political movie, but a sports movie. Remember the Titans brings alive on the screen racial division as well as unity. A true story of a high school sports team that is integrated. So if you haven't seen Remember the Titans, anybody not seen Remember the Titans? You should see Remember the Titans. I'm pretty sure it's on Disney Plus, maybe Netflix.
It's
something
on
like that. So let me borrow your notes here. You got this backside, just some thinking, questions, picture, and reflection. And don't mess this up on your notes from yesterday. Your notes from the past 2 days, it says right here, choose an article, read about it. I've posted inside of Google Classroom. There's like 8 links for you to choose from. Maybe it's like 6. Choose one of those extra links, read the article, just answer these basic questions. Kind of the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why. These both will be due on Friday. Okay, both of these pages will be due on Friday. Don't mess that up. Don't turn in a blank page. Don't turn in a blank page. I can't grade a blank page. Read the article, answer the question. All right? Thank you for your time and attention. Go ahead and tidy the room up. These are your seats for the rest of the semester. Let's put our Chromebooks up. Close off.
Wait, do you think his friends still think of him like when doing stuff like this?
Absolutely. I think his legacy